Hello, I'm John Alterman, the Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy at CSIS. I'm pleased to welcome you to the rollout of our report on hostage-taking and wrongful detention. I'm here with my co-director of the project, Washington Post journalist Jason Rezaian. Most of the policy issues that Washington think tanks deal with are a step removed from their human impacts. We often talk about governments or populations, but not really about individuals. This topic is different. It's all about individuals and how they suffer not because of anything they did, but because of the passport that they hold. Jason knows this firsthand. On July 22nd, 2014, the Iranian government put him and his wife in Tehran's Evin prison.
John, that experience changed everything in our lives. When Yegi and I were arrested from our home, taken to Evin prison, it started a 544-day ordeal that we had no idea how it would resolve. She and I endured months of solitary confinement, threats of execution, ostensibly because we were accused of espionage. We understood that we hadn't done anything against Iranian law, but it didn't become clear to us for many months that actually we were being held because I was an American citizen and the Iranian regime was trying to use me as leverage in negotiations with the US government. I understood and felt that deep sense of injustice during that time. What I didn't realize was that this was happening more and more around the world. And when I came home, I decided that I wanted to do something about it.
So I met Jason at a friend's house about 4 years ago, and he told me his story. It resonated with me. It reminded me of when I was in high school, and revolutionaries overran the US Embassy in Tehran and held 52 American diplomats hostage for 444 days. The event shocked the country. After college, I was working on Capitol Hill. We had a constituent whose brother was Terry Anderson, the AP bureau chief in Beirut. He was kidnapped and held hostage, and one of my jobs was to put a statement in the congressional record every day about his captivity. More recently, close friends were arrested and held in Evin prison. Haleh Esfandiari, who was my counterpart running the Middle East program at the Woodrow Wilson Center, was arrested on spying charges, just like Jason, when she was visiting her mother in Iran, and she was held in solitary confinement at Evin for 105 days. I met Siamak Namazi in the late 1990s and knew him as a superb analyst of Iran. I visited him at his apartment in Tehran when I was there in 2000. In 2015, he was arrested on spying charges. He wasn't freed until September 2023. All of these people were Americans, and that was their crime. So when Jason told me his story, it felt familiar.
For me, I understood and knew the stories of the people that you mentioned there. What I didn't know was that this was the beginning of a new hostage crisis. More and more Americans being taken by a series of authoritarian governments around the world, used as leverage in diplomatic negotiations with the United States. And so when I came back to living, I would say a recovered and normal life again, going back to full-time reporting at the Washington Post, I focused a lot of my time and attention on the growing number of cases of this sort of state hostage-taking or wrongful detention that we were seeing happening around the world. And I realized that there was only so much I could do in a Washington Post column. What I wanted to do, and to your great credit, John, you took me up on the idea, was to try and affect policy on hostage issues. The US government will do what it can to bring Americans home safely, but I believe we can do a better job of it, that we can do it more quickly, more efficiently, and hopefully over time put this long-term problem to bed so that people won't have to deal with it moving forward. As we've seen in the cases of Americans around the world, Brittany Griner in Russia, a WNBA superstar who was arrested at Moscow's airport and held for well over a year until she was released in a hostage exchange. Paul Whelan, a retired U.S. serviceman who, like me, was charged falsely with espionage while visiting friends in Russia. Evan Gershkovich, a case that feels very close to my own. Evan was the Wall Street Journal's correspondent in Russia until he was arrested and detained and accused of false charges of espionage. And Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, a British citizen who, again, was arrested by the Iranian regime weeks after my release, held in Evin prison for 7 years before she was ultimately released in a negotiated settlement between the Iranian and UK governments. I see this happening again and again. We see it happening again and again, and we hope that we're able to do something to address this problem.
The commission that Jason and I set up met for 2 years under the leadership of Ambassador Robert O'Brien and Senator Jeanne Shaheen. We met in person and virtually, and we had a retreat together. We wrote a report that's intentionally short, just 8 pages. Today we're going to talk about the main recommendations of that report. We'll talk about how to deter states from taking Americans, how to persuade Americans not to travel to dangerous places, and more. You'll meet members of the commission, family members, and people who've worked in the US government to free Americans.
When we set out to build this commission, we couldn't have thought of a more appropriate person than Robert O'Brien to help us lead this initiative. Of course, Mr. O'Brien served as both National Security Advisor and the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs in the first Trump administration. Ambassador, I want to ask you first and foremost, why is the issue of wrongful detention such a critically important one?
Well, Jason, thank you for that kind introduction. Look, it's critical because of the people involved. I mean, we do so many things in politics that are about policy and about big issues, and this distills it down into a small issue. It's a single person in a dungeon or a cave or a prison cell, and they've got no hope. And we've got to be that solution, try and be the I don't want to overplay it in a religious sense, the savior for that person and go get them. And there are so few things in government that are like that, where you can make an individual difference in someone's life. This is one of those issues. It's one of the few issues where you can make that kind of difference. And I think, Jason, that's why it's such a nonpartisan issue or a bipartisan issue. I worked with Democrats and Republicans. It didn't matter what party someone was. The senators from both sides of the aisle helped. Senator Shaheen helped in the Pastor Brunson case quite extensively. And so this is an area that we could get past what someone thought about President Trump or someone thought about President Biden and get to the core matter of helping an American citizen who needed our assistance.
To your mind, has the commission succeeded in doing what we set out to do, which was to provide some innovative tools to address this ancient challenge?
Jonathan, I think it has. Of course, I think we have to be modest in this. This has been going on since the pirates took Caesar and as a hostage in 70 AD or 70 BC. So this has been going on a long time. We're not going to solve it, but what we can do is make it better. And so some of the things that the commission's come up with, and some of your specifically your ideas, John, is like increasing deterrence and working with our allies to get more of a united front, not just with America, but the whole free world, getting them behind the idea that hostage taking is just no longer something that can go on. It's got to be like piracy and slavery. It's got to be banished to those tiny corners of the world that, and even there we should seek out to end the scourge. So I think that was a good idea, and I know that was something you were very big advocate for, and I think it makes a lot of sense. So I think we were successful, and I think that if some of these tools are implemented, I mean, just on the individual basis, the idea that hostages come home and they've got back taxes and tax penalties, and or that the FBI doesn't debrief them to find out what they could learn to help a future hostage in the same country. I mean, some of these are just common sense ideas that the Commission's come up with, and I think they make a lot of sense.
Ambassador, were some of these recommendations things that would have been helpful for you on the job as SPIHA had they existed during that time?
Well, sure, Jason. I mean, one of the things I think about is the difference between a wrongful detainee and a hostage. So we had instances where we had families who the secretary wanted to meet with, Secretary Pompeo, or the president wanted to meet with, or we had President Trump, and if they were considered a quote hostage, the FBI would pay for the airfare for the families to come. If you were a wrongful detainee, you had to foot your own airfare, and there was no help for you. So there's some basic things like that would have been quite helpful for me. We got it done. We always found money in the State Department, or found some way to make it right for the families, because we didn't want to burden them at all. But it would have been easier if some of these recommendations of the Commission were in place at the time.
You had mentioned the importance of international cooperation. Where could we improve international cooperation in your judgment?
Well, international cooperation, it's always hard, John. Churchill famously said, the only thing worse than fighting a war with allies is fighting a war without allies. And this is a bit of a diplomatic war. This hostage taking is increasing, unfortunately. I mean, we've got more and more countries have decided that there's a benefit to taking hostages and engaging in hostage diplomacy. So we really have to, and the U.S. can deal with some of it. We can't deal with all of it on our own. So we need, our Anglosphere friends, or our Five Eyes friends, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the UK, but we also need Japan and Germany and NATO, and we need to really rally the free world so that these bad actor countries understand that if you take a hostage, you're not just going to spoil your relations with the United States, the country that you're taking the hostage from. You're going to create a serious reputational damage to your nation beyond that country. So we need somebody to understand if they take a Canadian hostage, they're taking on the U.S., they're taking on NATO, they're taking on Five Eyes in Japan and South Korea. And likewise, if someone takes an American hostage, it's not just poking the Yankee, it's not just poking the American bear, you're poking the whole world.
Ambassador O'Brien, you and I have been talking about these issues for coming up on a decade now, and we've seen a lot of twists and turns in the types of cases that there are. We've had some good successes bringing people home, but what would success look like to you on this issue if these commission reports were implemented?
Well, Jason, number one, you're the right guy to get on this commission to be talking about these issues, because you face this issue. You yourself are a hostage, you're a wrongful detainee in Iran, and I'll put in a plug for your book. I was just a hostage on when your book came out. I was reading it on the plane coming back from an overseas visit, and it gave me a lot of insight. And so, if people are interested in the issue, they should read your book. And but look, what success would look like is, and I think we're seeing some of that with President Trump, is that we get Americans home that are held abroad now, and we lessen the incentive for these bad actor nations, these countries that are non-state actors that engage in malign activity, to take hostages. And if we can lower the incentives and deter them and bring Americans home, we can eventually get to a point where the portfolio of hostages, the number of baseball cards I used to carry around gets pretty small, and that would be success.
Thank you very much.
Great to be with both of you. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you.
So before we go any further, let me give you a sense for some of the report's recommendations. The first is the report focuses a lot on deterrence. People talk about deterrence in the hostage-taking space, but we really tried to flesh out what deterrence should mean. When you're deterring, it means countries don't take Americans for leverage in the first place. How do you get there? Well, as we thought about it, the way to get to more deterrence is because you're able to communicate clearly to countries that the costs of taking Americans is higher than the rewards they're going to get. And one big way we talked about that was having the State Department issue an annual report on hostage taking and wrongful detention. And a key part of that report should be a clear ranking among all the countries that how they treat hostage taking and wrongful detention. And we came up with this idea of having tiers. If you're in tier 1, there's no recent history of wrongful detention or hostage taking. Tier 2, a little bit more worrying, at least one recent case, or a country that imposes exit bans on Americans, or reduces consular access for Americans who've been arrested. Tier 3, we're getting to serious things: ongoing engagement in wrongful detention or hostage taking, failure to act against groups that do it, or continuing to hold Americans after being notified by the US government that it considers this a case of wrongful detention or hostage taking. If you get to tier 4, these are the really bad actors: persistent and systematic engagement in wrongful detention or hostage taking, or support for groups or governments that do so. When you get to tier 4, there are real consequences. The report sets out a whole series of punishments for that the president can choose from. If you're in tier 3, the president can impose one of these every year. Tier 4, the president can impose 3 every year. If the hostage taking and wrongful detention goes away, the penalties go away. But there's a very clear correlation between what you do, how you behave, and the consequences of that behavior. This adds transparency to both what governments are doing and how the US government views what they're doing, and it creates consequences for bad behavior. We also argue that there are some times when other states are really holding Americans hostage. We use the hostage word because it's all about leverage. Now, hostage taking is a serious crime in many countries' domestic laws, including the United States. It's a crime in international law. And we argue that if countries are doing this over and over again, the US government should have an option to say this is hostage taking, because the threat of calling it hostage taking in some cases influences government behavior. It should give the US government tools in US law and international law to punish perpetrators. What it does is it gives American negotiators an opportunity to escalate and hopefully resolve these cases more quickly. We also have a whole series of steps that try to encourage Americans to think twice, 3 times, 4 times before traveling to a serious place, or their organizations that sponsor them to have American citizens travel to dangerous places. And we try to think of ways to make it less convenient for Americans to travel to some of these dangerous places. And we have some recommendations about how the US government should be organized to help take care of families of people who've been wrongfully detained and detainees after they return to the United States.
John, when a detainee, a hostage, comes home, I speak from experience, it's a joyous and wonderful chapter in your life. But the honeymoon ends really quickly. And unfortunately, the US government isn't set up to properly support these returning detainees, whether it's problems with our credit history, back taxes that shockingly mount up while you're being detained, issues with bureaucratic minor details like getting a driver's license renewed, getting your insurance renewed. This is the sort of thing that the US government can and should be doing to help returning hostages. It's not a massive number of people. We're talking about dozens of people a year, and hopefully fewer in the future. But we really should put a concerted effort into supporting these folks when they get home and have systems in place. And also, bafflingly, there isn't a process of debriefing wrongful detainees when they come home. myself and every former hostage of the Islamic Republic of Iran will tell you that none of us, although we've been held by the same perpetrators, have been put through a process of debriefing and providing details about our captivity. And I think that's something that is a major lapse and something that we should fix.
All very important, but of course, this really isn't about bureaucratic issues, it's about people. And there's no one better at reminding us of the human cost of this practice than Diane Foley. The journalist Jim Foley was kidnapped in Syria on November 22nd, 2012, and he was killed by ISIS on August 19th, 2014. 2 weeks later, his mother, Diane Foley, created the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation to deal with the problem of kidnapping, to get the US government engaged, and to help others avoid the same fate that her beloved son had. Diane, thank you so much for joining us. One of the things that's struck me as we've talked, and I've seen what the Foley Foundation has done, is you've really brought home the extent to which the victims of kidnapping, hostage taking, wrongful detention aren't just the people being held, it's the families too.
Exactly. I was shocked when Jim was beheaded after nearly 2 years in captivity. I just couldn't believe that our government had not only abandoned him, but the 3 other Americans with him. And in that same time frame, there were 4 others who were actually abandoned by our government. So it was clear to me that our government needed to rethink this. I just couldn't believe it, because we had 3 youngsters in the military, and they always said that we never leave an American behind, and I applauded that idea. But knowing that our son had gone into Syria as a journalist, just like Jason, wanting to make sure our world could understand what was happening in that part of the world, the fact that our government did not see his return as a priority was very concerning to me. And I just felt our country could and had to do better. So that was my hope.
Diane, at the time that Jim was taken hostage, how was the government set up to deal with families, if at all?
It wasn't. It wasn't. As a matter of fact, I quit my job in early 2013 because I thought, golly, I've got to figure this out. And I began monthly trips to Washington. I was courteously received, cordially received, but passed around, if you will. Always saw mid-level people who had no power to help me, but no one was really honest with me and told me that until much later, until a few months before Jim's murder. That when David Bradley had helped us realize that Jim was not alone, but instead with other Americans. That's when we had some straight answers, if you will. Mark Mitchell was very clear about telling us that our government was going to do nothing. They were not going to send a rescue mission. They were not going to ask another country to help us. But if we dared to pay ransom, we could face prosecution. And it was a really daunting way to be treated. However, he was the one who was most truthful.
So people talk now about the hostage enterprise. How was the hostage enterprise created, and how does it engage with families that are in the same position you were back in 2012, 2013?
As I said, there was nothing when I was there. So within a month of Jim's murder, we were at the White House, talking about the fact that we could do better. After that, poor Stephen was killed, then Peter, shortly after Kayla, and it became obvious to the Obama administration that they at least had to look at the issue. And so they told me they were trying to figure out how to look at it. And it was actually in the new year that he gave the job to the National Counterterrorism Center to actually do an evaluation of our hostage response as a nation. Obama did his Presidential Policy Directive 30, which came out the end of June 2015. And that's what actually set up the three-prong government hostage enterprise that exists today, with the hostage recovery group at the White House, National Security Council, the Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs at the State Department, and the hostage recovery fusion cell based at the FBI. It really wasn't meant to be at the FBI because it is supposed to be an interagency fusion cell, but the FBI has given the space, so that's where it has remained. But it's been that enterprise that has endured ever since, and then was built on and codified with the Levinson Act in 2020.
Diane, one of the things that you have been so influential in is creating a community through the Foley Foundation, also to bring families together. And I can tell you from experience, that's meant a lot to me and my family and so many others. Talk about what it's been like to build that community and bring people together around this issue.
Well, that felt so important, Jason, because it is such a lonely experience. In our case, our government did not even let us know there were other U.S. citizens with Jim. It was only through the help of my friend David Bradley that we learned that Jim was not alone. And shortly thereafter, after Jim's murder, so many good people sent us donations to do something in his name. And that was part of the impetus to try to think of a silver lining, something that could continue Jim's moral courage and goodness into the world. And that's when we chose to, first we helped fund Hostage US, so they could get that match by the Ford Foundation and get them started, and the Alliance for a Culture of Safety. And then we actually started working on our own advocacy within our own government.
So Diane, you've been doing this for more than 10 years. As you say, the hostage enterprise is profoundly different. The problem is morphed from terrorist groups to states doing this more and more. In your mind, what's left to do? What are the most important priorities?
Well, there's still a lot of work to do. There really is. Stateside, we need to get better at the wrongful detention designation process and make that more transparent to families, so families know where they stand. We need to help when hostages come home. There's a huge amount of problems that face anyone who comes home. Jason knows firsthand, you know, hostages who've been in captivity for 5 to 10 years are asked to pay taxes. They're behind on their bills. It's just ludicrous, the things that are thrown at these people who've been in captivity for years. So, and there's need for mental health and physical support when people have been in captivity for many years. And then on a broader scale, we must look at how do we stop this? How do we deter the use of human beings as political pawns? And so to me, that's a huge international effort that that has been started, thankfully, through partners with Canada and looking at arbitrary detention, the UN and others. But we must strategically decide as a nation, how are we going to work on deterring this practice?
Diane, as always, thank you very much for your work and for your vision.
Thank you, Diane.
Thank you both for all you're doing.
Jason, as you know, Diane is a remarkable advocate for families. Let's talk now with someone who sees his job as fighting for hostages and wrongfully detained Americans every day. Adam Boehler is the Special Envoy for Hostage Response in the Trump administration. He's a healthcare executive. He was a founding board member of Operation Warp Speed that developed a COVID vaccine and was the first CEO of the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. Adam, thank you very much for joining us. You're the Special Envoy for Hostage Response. You could have had almost any job in this administration. Why did you want this one?
When I was running DFC, a lot of what we did was foreign policy as well as development work, and I worked really closely with Robert O'Brien when he was the National Security Advisor. And in my first meeting with Robert, it was in Asia. It was the first time I met him, and he met the president of China, and we were negotiating back and forth. And he gave 2 Bibles to the president of China and asked him to bring them to some hostages that China had at the time. And after the meeting, I said, oh, wow, I've never been in a meeting. I had known the prior NSA. No one ever brought that up. And he said, well, that was the job I did before. And he explained his role as SPIHA, and it stuck with me. And I thought, what an unbelievable job to be able to work to bring Americans home. Something so tangible, I'm sure so rewarding. And so when this role came up, for me, it stuck with me, and it was the first thing I thought of.
Adam, can you talk a bit about your approach to doing this work and how it may be different from your predecessors, Robert O'Brien and Roger Carstens?
I think a few things. First of all, there's probably similarities and some differences. One, my goal and the goal of my team is similar, which is bringing every single American home, and then make sure that other countries don't take Americans again. And we're 100% focused on that mission. One thing that I think is different, and every administration is different, one thing that I know is that the President of the United States now has this very much in his heart. President Trump has been very empowering and has also identified, hey, look, there are a lot of classifications for Americans that are technical, whether that's when someone becomes technically a hostage, when they become wrongfully detained, when they become unjustly detained. And I will say that in this administration, the president has empowered me to go and say it's not only wrongfully detained and hostages, anybody that's unjustly detained, and we want to make sure that you work across the whole of government to get those Americans out. And I think that's been very empowering, but also an evolution. I don't think it's so much as it's different from Rob or different. I think you stand on the shoulders of great people before you, and this has been an evolution of the role too.
You've been in all kinds of negotiations with all kinds of people, but I don't think you've really been negotiating for the freedom of Americans before you had this job. What have you learned being in this job that you didn't know before you started it?
I think that in any case, obviously in a job like this, you're dealing with bad guys, sometimes really bad guys. And you need to hold your own in those meetings, and you need to think through and put yourself in their place. Even if that feels very odd, the best way that you can think is by trying to understand incentives on the other side, even if they're very bad people. And I think it's a different skill set. Probably until you do it, you don't know if you can do it. You don't know if you can sit in a room with folks that really are extremely different in terms of approach than you are. And I think that's a very important part of the role. It's to sit down with folks and then do the best you can in all circumstances to accomplish your mission, which is to bring Americans home.
Adam, what are the useful tools that this commission report recommends that you would be happy to have in doing this job?
I think you guys focus a lot on deterrence, and I like that. One of the things that I mentioned is getting Americans home, but the second is just as, if not more important, which is how do you ensure that they're never taken again? And I think really strong deterrence is important. And a lot of what you identify in this report are both positive and negative levers to make sure that people understand that taking Americans is not productive. It doesn't result in a better deal for you. In fact, we can't even really have discussions of a serious nature until you don't hold Americans. It's unacceptable. And so I think some of the things that you bring out in the report really create some of the elements that say, don't take them in the first place, because it's going to be a disaster once you do.
You'll have to talk to Adam Bowler.
That's right. No one wants to talk to me. Once I get there, it's no good.
Adam Bowler, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks for the work you do.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, guys.
Diane Foley and Adam Bowler talked about the importance of deterrence, but what does it really mean? There's no better person to ask than Professor Danielle Gilbert. She's a political scientist at Northwestern University, and she's been a pioneer using the tools of political science to understand hostage-taking and how to stop it. So Danny, help us understand this. Can you explain to us what deterrence is? And if deterrence doesn't work, where are we?
So when we talk about deterrence, it's about preventing someone from doing something they haven't done. It's seeking to kind of maintain the status quo, not to have somebody not do something you don't want them to do. Compellence is the flip side. It's to convince someone through threats and promises to do something they otherwise might not do. Compellence is about changing someone's behavior, whereas deterrence is about preventing that behavior.
How often is compellence successful?
The academic literature suggests that compellence is really only successful about a third of the time. These are studies that measure things like economic sanctions, which tend to be policies put on adversaries, other governments, that we're going to sanction your economy because of something you're doing. And we want those sanctions to get you to change your behavior. And they really only work a small minority of the time. Most of the time, compellence is unsuccessful.
How do you see the report's recommendations contributing to deterrence?
How can the United States government deter countries from getting into the hostage-taking business in the first place? How can we convince countries that it is not in their best interest to take Americans and to hold them for leverage? At the moment, it seems like a lot of perpetrators see a lot of value in hostage-taking. They're not taking Americans hostage because they are sadistic. They're taking Americans hostage because they see that there's a benefit to taking someone and holding them for leverage. And so how can we change that cost benefit calculus? How can we make it not worth someone's while to hold an American arbitrarily or wrongfully or coercively? And so the report is thinking about ways that the United States government can make clear to other countries around the world, this is a practice that we do not want you to engage in. And here's how the United States government is going to think about kind of evaluating you, assessing your behavior, and punishing you if you continue to or start engaging in hostage-taking behavior. And so one of the things that the report recommends is an annual report in Congress where they will look at countries around the world, assess, are they in the hostage-taking game? If so, how many Americans are they holding hostage? What are the conditions under which they are holding Americans hostage? Effectively, how extensive, how severe is this phenomenon? And then ranking countries accordingly based on those very specific public metrics of hostage-taking behavior. And then once they get these rankings, they will be sorted into different levels. And with those levels come punishments that the United States government should be very clear about. So if your country escalates from minimal hostage taking to taking more hostages, here are the punishments that follow. If your country gets into the hostage taking game that it previously wasn't in, here are the punishments that will follow. So it's setting up kind of the system of criteria, stating them publicly, committing to an annual report so that we can be really clear about the punishments that will follow this kind of behavior.
Danny, you used the word hostage a lot, and as you know, the US government's current practice is not to use the word hostage when we're referring to state imprisonment of people. How did you come around to thinking that hostage taking is the right phrase to use in some of these circumstances?
The criteria for wrongful or unlawful detention range pretty dramatically. There's 11 different criteria. And the more that I have thought about looking at those different criteria, some of them really align with this category in international law known as arbitrary detention. And some of the criteria, and one in particular, really aligns with the category of hostage taking. One of these criteria, in other words, is about holding someone for leverage, holding someone to get the US government to change their behavior. Those are the cases that we've become most familiar with. In the media, in politics, we're thinking about cases where governments like Venezuela, like Russia, like Iran are holding Americans through their criminal justice system because they are trying to coerce a concession from the US government, be it a prisoner exchange, a payment, lifting of sanctions, and other concessions of that nature. I think we should call those cases hostage takings. I think we should call the people who experience them hostages because they are being held not because of anything they did, not because of who they are, but they are being held as a bargaining chip for leverage. And I think it's important to call those cases hostage takings because there is international law that prohibits hostage taking. Hostage taking is a criminal offense. And if we want to get serious about coordinating internationally with allies, if we want to get serious about coming up with domestic and international legal instruments to deal with this phenomenon, we should really call it what it is.
Thank you, Danny. We can't forget that the phenomenon of hostage taking isn't about theory, it's about real people. Sarah Levinson Moriarty is the daughter of Robert Levinson, an American businessman who disappeared on Kish Island off the southern coast of Iran in 2007. For many years, the US government said it didn't know where he was, and it ultimately concluded that he was captured by the government of Iran and died in captivity. Sarah, thank you very much for joining us. You and your family have really turned tragedy into purpose. What was it like dealing with the US government when your dad disappeared?
I think it was really hard. My mom and my brother and my aunt were the ones having regular conversations, probably daily conversations with the US government, but it was argumentative, it was confrontational. There was a lot of infighting, there was a lot of lack of clarity on who was the person to talk to about which issue. A lot of confusion that continued for a really long time. This was at the very beginning of Americans being taken, and I think trying to navigate that complicated government landscape with no playbook in existence whatsoever was really, really hard. And so I'm very thankful that we've been able to see some progress in this space to help others where it was so hard for my family.
One of the things you've been very creative and articulate on is various ways to convince people that some places are just not safe to travel to. How do you think we should think about persuading people not to travel to dangerous places?
So I think it's hard because I think everyone thinks that it would never happen to them. I think you have a number of people who go to some of these places either thinking they're safe or thinking that they're, like for example in Colombia, going to Colombia and not over the border to Venezuela, and then somehow they find themselves over the border and taken. I think we need to get through to every American national that it could be any one of us. It could be our neighbor, it could be our friend, it could be our family member.
That's about us. What about countries that are holding Americans?
My dad was the first one to be taken in what we now could consider the new hostage crisis. And so we've been watching this for 18 years and nothing's ever been done tangibly to stop people. So we're averaging at least one American being taken every week for the past several years. And what we've seen is we've done these great negotiations to bring Americans home over the past few years, but we've not done anything tangible to stop it from happening. And so each of these countries like Iran, Venezuela, Russia, continue to build up their stockpiles so that they can make their next deal instead of actually stopping. And so deterrence is really important to stop these countries, but also to stop other countries from learning from this behavior and doing it for themselves.
Well, I believe, and I hope you both agree, that the report is filled with new and innovative ideas on that very issue. So thank you very much for all the work.
And that's partly due to Sarah's contributions, so thank you.
Thank you, and both of you, thank you for all of your great work to bring this important issue to the forefront on everyone's minds.
For 5 years, the person in the US government who thought more than anyone about Americans being wrongfully held abroad was Ambassador Roger Carstens, appointed the special presidential envoy for hostage affairs by President Trump in 2000. President Biden retained him in the role, and he served throughout the Biden administration. Roger, what are some of the most important lessons you learned from being in the role of the special presidential envoy?
One of them would be empathy. If you cannot be empathetic, then you really can't work in this space. And I say that with regards to how a person as a government employee should and must treat the family members of someone who's been detained. You have to bring every ounce of empathy to these engagements and recognize that there's something that they're going through that you'll never be able to comprehend, but you have to try to at least do your best to put yourself in their place so that you can treat them the way that they need to be treated. And that's with love, respect, kindness, and compassion. But the empathy also extends to negotiations. When you're negotiating with a hostile opponent or someone who's taken an American citizen wrongly, you still have to be empathetic and you still have to show respect. You know, I found that going in with, I would say, arrogance and a lack of humility does not get me closer to the objective. Whereas going in with empathy, respect, and seeking to understand what the other side's trying to communicate and what they want to achieve usually seems to bring us closer to getting the result that we want, which is bringing that American home.
You had the title of Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, but in many ways you needed a lot of other people in the US government to help you. How were you able to be successful getting the entire US government aligned with what you were trying to achieve?
I found that the negotiations that take place that are the most important are not the ones that you have with the country or hostage or terrorist group that's taken your American citizen. The most important negotiations seems to be the ones that take place in Washington, D.C., within the interagency area. You'll find yourself, when trying to align people with a certain strategy, negotiating with members of the Department of Treasury, the Secretary of State's office, other people within the State Department buildings, as well as the CIA, the Department of Defense, and really just the White House writ large. So while you might think that getting someone back from Venezuela requires a negotiation between the United States and President Maduro, what you really find is that negotiation is only successful if you're able to align people within the United States government to come up with the strategy, come up with what the United States is willing to give to get their citizens back, and then come up with a way and a process of having these back and forth with the people that are actually holding these American citizens. It's never just SPIHA. It's never really just the Department of State, the US government. A lot of times it requires partners, allies, it requires NGOs, self-empowered individuals, members of the media, businesses. It's a huge effort. And only with everyone in the mix trying to get aligned and come up with that strategy and execute it, do you end up bringing someone home.
You had a lot of triumphs, you had a lot of frustrations. Was there a moment that struck you as the best moment and a moment that struck you as the worst moment?
Maybe I had a best moment multiplied by 65 times. And that was that very short moment. And it doesn't last forever. It's like, it might be a 10-second snapshot of months and months, maybe years of work. But when the person that's having been held from, or rather the American that's been held from their loved one's arms out of reach for maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years, when they're finally released by the terrorist group or the hostile nation that's holding our citizens, and they return to the United States, step on a U.S. tarmac, and fall into the hands of and the arms of their families, that's always the most powerful and righteous and joyous moment that you experience in this effort. It really is brutal, hard work where for the most part you're failing, and then things just suddenly seem to come together like a Rubik's Cube and everything aligns and you're able to get your victory in short order. But to witness that 10-second reunion on a tarmac on US soil might take 2 or 3 years of brutal, hard, nonstop work to get to that moment.
As a final question, the report had a lot of recommendations. We'd like to ask first, are there some that you think were especially helpful? And more to the point, were there any that you think would be especially helpful ensuring that you had more of those moments of joy in this job?
When I take a look at the recommendations, I find myself wishing that I would had some of those recommendations being put into the implementation phase, and I wish I would have had that while I was SPIHA. There are things on the list of recommendations that I think are going to change the game. One has been very important to Jason Rezaian, and that is the expansion and the greater use of the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. If you're able to perhaps take a judgment and or sue or have a lawsuit against a nation state which has taken you or your loved ones and held them as a hostage, and that's going to start changing the calculus on these nations that do take Americans. It's going to also, I would say, send a strong message to people who are even thinking about doing that. I would say also trying to make sure that we're succeeding on the prevention side of the house. I love some of the recommendations that would hopefully discourage U.S. citizens from risky travel behavior. Anything from taxing or surcharges on travel fees that they might experience while trying to get to a place that's rather scary, a place that might actually detain them. But I also think acknowledging the risk that you're about to take, especially if you're an organization. If you're an organization sending your people, whether you're a business, an NGO, and you're putting your people in harm's way, I think it's important to acknowledge the risk that that organization's taking, and maybe even the individual. So I would say if I'd leave with one more, I think I was always, well, grateful that the Levinson Act of 2020 gave us the 11 criteria with which we're to use to identify when someone's been wrongfully detained by a nation state. I always felt like we didn't get it right, and I always felt uncomfortable when we could not explain our thought process to either members of Congress when they're trying to hold us accountable, which is their job, or whether I was talking to a family of someone who wanted to know why their loved one had not yet been declared as wrongfully detained. So maybe the one thing that hits me most personally from these recommendations is increasing the clarity that surrounds the wrongful detention process. I think that alone is going to increase trust with the government. It's going to make things a lot clearer for the case officers in SPIHA and the USG writ large. And I think it's going to allow those who do hold us accountable, members in the media and members on Capitol Hill, to get a better sense of whether the US government, the executive branch, is hitting their milestones and objectives, if they're doing the jobs that we've been entrusted to do. But in the 3 areas that I outlined, those alone, I wish I would have had those while I was SPIHA. I'm grateful for all of these recommendations. They're all solid. And the reason they're solid is because CSIS did a masterful job of bringing together the right group of people from all different parts of the hostage recovery enterprise to bring these recommendations to the fore. So I'm grateful for a chance to speak about them.
Thank you, Roger. We hope today's presentation has given you a sense of the seriousness of the challenge of hostage taking and wrongful detention, some of the remarkable people who are helping to fight this phenomenon, and some of the tools we can use to make the practice even less common. You can find the entire report, a one-page summary of its conclusions, and a moving personal introduction to the topic that Jason wrote on the CSIS website, www.csis.org.
In closing, John, I just want to say a deep personal thank you to you and to CSIS for believing in the importance of this issue, for giving space for this commission, but also to the commissioners who took part, to the officials and members of the U.S. government from both parties who put their personal politics aside and got to work with us on this issue. to all our friends in academia and journalism who've taken this issue so seriously and engaged with you and I and the entire commission on our findings. This is the culmination of 2 years of intense work. And I believe if implemented, this has a real opportunity to change the equation. And I hope that that policymakers, stakeholders agree and take a good look at our recommendations. Thank you all for being with us.
Thank you.